Okay, here we go. We're going to finish up incarnationalism and representation today, and then we'll move on to the next one. But again, just
Dr. Mark, did you start the recording?
I did. Thank you. Thank you. I did remember. I'm getting better in my old age. Remember that there's a sense in which we present both. There's no way that I would tell you that when you go out to the mission fields of the world with the gospel, don't try to be like Christ. That would be. But the question is, how are we like Christ? And the answer to that is, in what way do we represent Christ? What way do we imitate Christ as missionaries?
Character.
Right. It's more a question of our character, the fruit of the Spirit, right? Because the unique nature of the mission of Christ. Now, we could say this as well. There is an aspect of Christ's ministry that does become front and center in our preaching. And what is that? What aspect of our preaching actually became the theme of Paul's preaching?
The gospel?
Yeah, and specifically, the redemption part of it, the climax, the gospel. Paul said, we preach Christ and him crucified. Okay, so, the emphasis of Paul's preaching, the theme of his preaching was the redemptive work of Christ. So, obviously, the signs that he performed were intended to identify him as the Messiah, as the one who was qualified to take on our redemption for us. Okay, so it's not that we're not emphasizing anything that Christ did. But we're emphasizing, and we do emphasize who he is. It's just that we don't put ourselves in that place as incarnation. I'm going to read you a quote in just a moment that may be in your notes. I don't remember, but I think really helps to understand that. Okay. So again, continuity. The incarnationalist view says we pretty much imitate everything that Christ was and did. Okay, which I don't think is possible. That's where the idea of, the liberation of society comes in, just as Christ is going to establish his kingdom. So we are going about helping people to realize political transformation, that sort of thing. Okay. Whereas in the representationalism view, there's more of the discontinuity. We recognize the uniqueness of Christ and his works and his signs and all that, but we do emphasize we are ambassadors of his. We preach the gospel of his redemptive work as we start churches. Okay? So, does that make sense, everybody? Questions about that? It's just, I would say this to you. Don't criticize somebody if they say, we incarnate the person of Christ. Don't jump down their throat. I don't think it's wrong to say that if properly understood. Okay? It's just that and here's the quote that I think is really helpful. Eckhart Schnabel is a really, anything you can get your hands on written by him is worth reading. He said, I submit that the use of the term incarnational is not very helpful to describe the task of authentic Christian missionary work. The event of the coming of Jesus into the world is unique, unrepeatable, and incomparable, making it preferable to use other terminology to express the attitudes and behavior that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 9 when he talks about becoming all things to all men and so on. The Johannine Missionary Commission in John 20:21 does not demand an incarnation of Jesus' disciples, but rather their obedience, unconditional commitment, and robust activity in the service of God and the power of the Holy Spirit. That's where the idea of ambassador comes in on that chart. Okay, we represent him. It is precisely John who describes the mission of Jesus. Let me hold on, I got to check and make sure I've got the right screen showing for our online students. All right. It is precisely John who describes the mission of Jesus as unique. Jesus is the only Son. He is pre-existent. His relationship to the Father is unparalleled. For John, it is not the manner of Jesus coming into the world in John 20:21. The Word becoming flesh, the incarnation, that is a model for believers. Rather, it is the nature of Jesus' relationship to the Father who sent him into the world, which is one of obedience to and dependence upon the Father. the terms contextualization or inculturation certainly are more helpful. Does that make sense? So the idea of the Father sending me, it's more of his relationship to the one who's being sent. He says, now I'm sending you, and therefore you will have a similar relationship to me as your sender. Okay. Now, when you read the book of Acts, who do you find, especially in Acts 13, is actually doing the sending? Yeah, separate me, Barnabas and Saul, to the work to which I, the Spirit speaking, has sent them. But you really can't separate the two, right? Jesus sends the Spirit as the one who represents him and points to him. So anyway, I just think that's helpful. All right, let me give you a few blanks here to fill in that in your notes, some details kind of filling this out. Number 2 in your notes is incarnational missiology. Jesus as the model missionary, and there are 3 basic types, okay? Our author likes to dig in and be as specific as he can. A is liberation incarnationalists. And again, just by looking at the word liberation, you're already thinking what? What's the main drive here? Social, political transformation, right? So number 1 is the word shalom. Shalom is, I think we talked about this word before, right? The other day, we said that it can mean a lot of things. But in the liberation theology context, shalom is the idea of world peace, of political peace, okay, not just spiritual peace. Number 2 is the name of the guy. I think you already have that filled in, Gustavo Gutierrez. He's the guy that promoted liberation theology in the middle of the last century. And then number 3, incarnationalism and the revival of liberation theology. Revival. I think I mentioned to you that a lot of people thought liberation theology had kind of died out in Latin America, and it did, and to some degree, but there seems to be a revival of it. Can you think of anything going on in politics today or in society today that seems to look kind of like a revival of liberation theology? Yeah.
Maybe almost kind of the idea that God is love and you just need to accept people as they are instead of judging them to bring about kind of that social peace.
Okay. All right. Okay. So it's kind of a watering down of the precision of the gospel. Just everybody. Okay. Good. What else? In our own country, you see more and more of a tendency to move in a socialistic direction in general. Okay. And even churches and institutions that call themselves evangelical have caved to this movement in the last several years. Not groups that we would hang out with, okay, but there are groups that have done that, and it is a way of expressing, a desire for the transformation of the government, the political system that will make everybody happy and bring everybody together. It's not exactly the same as what happened in Latin America with liberation theology, okay? It's not driven primarily by the Catholic Church, but the influence of the resurgence of communism. When communism was, quote unquote, died in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, the Iron Curtain and all that, a lot of people thought, well, that's the end of communism. But you heard other people saying, and I was 1989, I was almost 30. You heard other people saying, don't fool yourselves. Communism is not dead. It just took a blow, and it'll be back. And sure enough, the socialism, even in our country and stuff, is heading back in that direction. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Doesn't mean liberation theology is going to come back the way it was before, but there at least remnants of it around. Okay, letter B is holism. And we've already, used the word holism. Remember, no W there, just HOLISM. Holism incarnationalists. Two things about them. One, the equality of evangelism and social action. Again, this harkens back to what we studied before. Some of these are tied together. Evangelism and social action almost lose their distinction. That's when it becomes dangerous. Again, we're not against social action, but social action must be subordinate to the spiritual ministry that Christ has commanded us. Okay? So evangelism and social action. Number two, little number two there, social deterioration as the fault of the church. If you hold to an incarnational, holistic view of missions, then when you see the church failing in America, for example, or appears to be, or let's say it this way: if you see political problems arising, okay, the natural tendency is to say the reason that's happening is because the church is not doing its job. And again, we did mention this in an earlier class, but it bears repeating that all of this is tied to a post-millennial view of eschatology. Church is bringing in the kingdom. So if the kingdom is not taking over in our culture, it's because the church is not doing its job. Okay, that's just part of the idea there. And I'm not saying that the church is necessarily doing its job, but I do believe that Jesus said, "I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." We do not believe that the church will fail. Otherwise, Christ has failed, ultimately. Letter C, conversion incarnationalists is the third kind. Conversion incarnationalists, and that's number one, the priority of evangelism and church planting. So there are those who call themselves incarnationalists. We are incarnating Christ, but we do place an emphasis on evangelism and church planting, okay? And so the priority is there. That would be a better position. Number two, Jesus as the pattern for contemporary missiology. Here's where I would, take issue. Jesus is the provision, but okay, let me say it this way. Jesus is the pattern in terms of our character. We've already acknowledged that. But he's not the pattern in terms of the way that we do ministry. Okay, Paul and the early church is the pattern. Remember that Jesus ministered before the church age. So what we are doing in the church age, the pattern that we follow, is a pattern established by the apostles. You see, there's a difference there. Remember that, where's the passage that says that the church was built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets? Where's that at?
Ephesians?
Yeah, Ephesians 2:20 says that the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. So the pattern for the way we do ministry is found in the book of Acts and in the epistles, okay? That's what we're saying. All right, number three is representational missiology. Representational missiology. And this is the other side of that chart where we view Paul as the pattern. So letter A, the words discontinuity and witness are key there. And again, if you look at your chart, you'll see those words. Discontinuity, we're not repeating what Jesus did because it's unrepeatable, as Schnabel says in this quote. And witness, we are not imitating what he did, we are witnessing to it. You see the difference? It's one thing to say we are repeating what Jesus did. It's another thing to say we are bearing witness to the uniqueness of what Jesus did. All right? Number one, there are three important questions here, letter B. Number one, what are today's missionaries to be? Give me, what's the word in 2 Corinthians 5 that describes who we are as missionaries?
As ambassador.
Ambassadors, right. So what is an ambassador, Val?
Like someone who represents the political
Right.
person.
Yep, represents. That's where this whole idea of representational missiology comes in. Ambassador is a key word. Give me another term that the New Testament uses to describe who we are. Are there other words that describe who a missionary is? Yeah,
I've heard some people argue the term apostle,
okay.
or sent one for missionary. But
Okay.
I don't know how everyone takes that term.
Is there anybody in the New Testament who is called an apostle who's not an apostle? Sounds like a weird question, but I stated it that way on purpose.
So
I can think of at least two people in the book of Acts who are called apostles who are not apostles. Who are they? Well, one was Barnabas. Okay. Luke uses the word apostles plural. The only two guys around are Barnabas and Paul. And then when in Galatians chapter 1, when Paul goes up to Jerusalem, just after being in Arabia, remember, he goes back to Damascus and he goes up to Jerusalem. He says, I didn't see any other of the apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Wait a minute. He just called him an apostle. He's not. So Caleb, how do we explain that?
well, there's the specific group of apostles that Jesus called, so the disciples, and I think we'd argue Paul as well.
Right.
He's called an apostle,
Right.
as one born out of due time.
Right.
But apostle can also just mean sent one,
Okay.
and that would be the case for Barnabas and for others in the New Testament who are sent out
Right.
to go and to share the gospel.
Right.
So in a sense, they are an apostle, but
Right.
not an apostle.
Okay, exactly. There's definitely a technical sense of the term referring to those 12, just like the 12 disciples. You know, there were lots and lots of disciples, but oftentimes when we talk about the disciples of Jesus, we are referring to those 12 guys, even though broadly speaking there were others. Now, would it be a good idea for you to go out and call yourself an apostle today as a missionary? I wouldn't recommend that. Because there's a lot, I mean, one of the chief writers today in the third wave movement is C. Peter Wagner. And he, according to some authors at least, has kind of become a self-designated apostle in the church today. So I would not encourage you to use the word apostle to identify yourself, you know, unless you have time to really explain what you mean by that, okay? All right, good. Number two, what are they to say? In other words, what's the essence of our message? Well, it is the gospel. I'm getting that to you there. Now, all right, this may sound really elementary to you, but let's hit it again. What is the gospel? I mean, I know it means good news, but give me what is the message of the gospel?
The short version is that the Son of God came down to earth, died on the cross to save us from our sins, and rose again. The long
Okay.
version really encompasses the whole Bible.
Good.
There's a broad arc.
All right, so, that's good. You've done a good job of giving us both emphases there. So you're in theology and missions class, and we remember Freitag's pyramid that we put up before his. So what do we call the part of Freitag's pyramid where you have the death and resurrection of Christ? Climax. Right. So normally when we talk about the gospel, we default immediately to the climax of the gospel, the death and resurrection of Christ. Okay. But you very correctly said that the gospel in its broader message takes in everything from the first promise back in the garden, crush the head of the serpent, all the way to the consummation. When it is finished, it is done. Right. And I want to encourage all of you, when you're thinking about, especially if you're thinking about ministering to people where biblical language is not understood, not assumed, where people are more illiterate, you know, in terms of the Bible, that when you think of the story, telling the gospel story, that you tell the whole story, help them understand the whole thing. It takes time, but it's worth the effort. Okay, the number three, what do they do? And okay, if we were having this discussion 200 years ago, we wouldn't even probably need to ask this question. If you were a missionary 200 years ago, your job is to
Preach the gospel.
what?
Preach
Preach the gospel.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's evangelize and plant churches, period. Anything beyond that was considered, non-missionary work. Okay? That has changed as a result of the Industrial Revolution and specialization and all that kind of stuff. And so today people associate a lot of other things with missions as well. Okay? Aviation, nursing, okay? Bible translation, MK schools. You got to be a teacher in an MK school somewhere. Okay, a lot of things like that. Okay, but what we don't say we're doing is going out and healing people and raising the dead and speaking in tongues, because that's what Jesus did. That's the difference. Okay. All right, these other, letter C, Paul's life and ministry is a model. These other, all these passages are simply passages where Jesus talks about modeling his life as he models Christ. If you're ever teaching or preaching a message on imitating Christ, there are some great passages for you. We won't read them all now. Concluding thoughts here, A, what would Jesus do, which is the famous what? Any of you guys ever wear a band, a WWJD band, or anything? Was that after your time? Was it?
I did it.
You did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it came on really strongly, what, in the 90s? I think. WWJD, what would Jesus do? And then some, kind of modified that, why would Jesus die, in WWJD. It was a big deal. But actually, are you guys aware of the fact that the whole what would Jesus do movement came out of a liberal church? Yeah, you've heard that story?
We had to read a book on that for school, like in high school.
Okay. Yeah, do you remember anything about that story, of how that happened? Jog your memory.
Let's see. It's been a while. So it was this pastor that was trying to have like a revival in his church. So he started like praying and stuff, and decided to encourage his church to take up this motto in every decision, whether it's big or small. Question, would Jesus do this?
Yeah.
So what would Jesus do in this particular instance or situation? And so like the book I read like followed like each of the church members as they're like at work, and this comes up and they would ask the question, what would Jesus do?
Right.
And yeah, like it was a good book.
Mm-hmm.
But you could see a lot of things that you were like, I don't know about this.
Yeah, the guy's name was Sheldon, Pastor Sheldon,
Yeah.
and it was a liberal church. Okay, it was pretty much social gospel type church. And right in the middle of one of the services, a drunk guy comes in. Just disrupts the service because everybody's really like, get this guy out of here, And so, he starts to think, man, what would Jesus have done if he were here and this guy came in? So that kind of propels the whole thing forward. So it becomes the church, as you said, really adopts that motto, what would Jesus do? And that's not a bad question, but it does send you down a little different path than if you were to ask Paul, what are we to do? What is our commission? Yeah.
Yeah, it was just really weird for me because I remember like all the churches around here, like for VBS, would like do the bracelets and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But then like 1 year, just like all quit. Like every single church just stopped it, and we're just like, what happened? And
Somebody probably preached a message on that. Oops.
yeah, so I just remember all quitting, and I was really confused the entire time. But
Yeah. And again, it's not wrong. I mean, how many times have you said, okay, if Jesus were in this situation here, what would he do? But that's a little different. Sometimes you're trying to decide, do I watch this movie or not? Do I go to this place or not? And if Jesus were here, would he do this? Do I eat this? I told somebody that we were having some very unhealthy food. I call it get to heaven quick food, just spiritual. Get you there faster. And I remember saying to them, I think if Jesus were invited over for dinner, he would eat some of this with us. I think we were talking about root beer floats or something like that. All right. So anyway, okay. So what would Jesus do? Is it a valid question? It is in a very limited sense, but I would not encourage you to. So anytime these fads come out, these waves, anytime something like that happens, make sure you get back to the roots of it. Where did this start? Who promoted this? And you might find that once you get that, you're not a good idea. B, is Jesus our prototype? There's a good word for you. Is he our prototype, or our example. What's the difference between a prototype and an example? What is a prototype?
Prototype is kind of unique. It's the one that precedes all the other ones that will follow. And usually there's something different about it that's changed in every one that follows after, so it's not exactly the same.
Okay, it's not exactly, but the idea is to imitate it. Proto means first type. So prototype would mean that Jesus is the first of a kind, and we are to imitate that kind as we move forward. And I would say, no, Jesus is not our prototype. Okay, he is first. Okay, but we're not trying to reproduce what Jesus did. Yeah.
And when I think of prototype, you kind of think about like upgrades. Like you have the prototype and then like you upgrade after that.
Oh,
Like machines. So I don't think that would really work with.
okay. Yeah, we definitely can't upgrade what Jesus did. Yeah, good. Example is a different word. Again, we would qualify that. Say he's our example in terms of character, but not in terms of methodology. C, is there any sense at all in which we incarnate Christ? And you could say, yes, we are to incarnate his character. But I kind of like, and again, I'm not going to say that if somebody uses the word, they're out of bounds. I prefer to avoid the word incarnation. I do not view myself as incarnating Christ in a different culture if I go there. Okay. I think that the uniqueness of the word incarnation should be preserved to describe what Jesus did. The immensity of what he did at the incarnation, I think, deserves to be preserved for that. Just my opinion. Okay. Any questions about this? We've kind of, you see there's some interplay between this and the previous one we did, previous case. All right, let's take a few moments then to talk about, there's a final slide just to answer that last question. He is our example in terms of character, not in terms of methods. Yes, oops, okay. Let's talk a little bit about power encounter. We're just gonna launch this one today and then we'll have to pick it up. All right. When you hear the phrase power encounter, what comes to your mind?
Like a spiritual showdown.
A what?
Like a spiritual showdown, like
A spiritual showdown.
or
Yeah,
something.
yeah. Good. What else? Yeah.
Just things like Elijah and the prophets of Baal,
Mhm.
or Boniface. I think he mentioned that in the reading, cutting down the tree of the God of Thunder.
Yeah. And in History of Missions, we hit on that one, right? Cut down the oak tree and everybody was, the gods are going to come after us. Nothing happened. Yeah. What else comes to your mind? Power encounter. All right. Let's fill in some blanks, and I think what I'm going to do maybe is save the PowerPoint. I have a PowerPoint probably for next class. Let's go ahead and get a jump start on filling in the blanks here. So let me get this camera redirected here since we won't need that. Let's see, there we go. Okay. All right. Power encounter and truth encounter. It's really hard for me to emphasize the importance of this. Let me just comment briefly on the title before I get into the notes. Power encounter is usually something that is visible, measurable, right? You see something, you hear something. Truth, by comparison, is what?
Something that is known.
Pardon?
Something that is known.
It's something that you know and believe, but it's not visible. Some would call it subjective. We don't consider truth subjective, but in terms of human senses, it is. It's not something you can grab onto, and whereas power encounters are. I'm just going to tell you from the top here that one of the reasons why power encounters have gotten so much press in the evangelical world today is for that reason. There's something you can show, you can talk about, you can measure, okay? And that we could go beyond power encounters and say that's one of the reasons why things like tongues and healings and all those, a word of knowledge or anything, all of those things are such a big deal. It's something you can measure. They're tangible. Truth is not. Okay, so just keep that in the back of your mind as we work through this. Two passages of scripture come to mind immediately, and actually I will show them on the PowerPoint later, but let's open up to Acts 8. First of all, the first one is Acts 8:13, and the second one is Acts 13:12. 8:13 and 13:12. So whoever gets there to 8:13, would you read that for us?
Even Simon himself believed, and after being baptized, he continued with Philip, and seeing signs and great miracles performed, he was amazed.
All right. Anybody remember where this happened? Philip, Acts 8, what?
Samaria?
Yeah, in Samaria, exactly. Philip went up to Samaria after the persecution that broke out, right? And Simon is a magician, he's a sorcerer, shaman, whatever would depict that. And so he's a man who is accustomed to manifesting supernatural powers, probably demonically inspired. People pay money for that, okay, for him to do things for them, to challenge. And so here comes Philip, and he manifests a power that's superior to anything that Simon's ever seen. So would you do me a favor, read that again, and notice the motive for which he believed. Go ahead and read that again.
Even Simon himself believed, and after being baptized, he continued with Philip, and seeing signs and great miracles performed, he was amazed.
Okay, so what was it that caught his attention? What amazed him?
Signs and miracles.
Yeah. Notice that Luke does not mention the message there. Not that the message wasn't there, but what caught his attention was signs of why? Because that's what he spent his life doing. Now, a lot of people question whether Simon actually became a believer. It does say he believed, but remember, the demons believe also and tremble. The word believe doesn't necessarily mean somebody is actually saved. Okay? Peter comes later on, and Peter does not believe he's saved. He says, your money perish with you, when he tries to buy power. My son he bought a desktop computer once from a company called I Buy Power. And that's exactly what Simon wanted to do. He wanted to buy the power of God. Now, but, Peter, says, your money perish with you. You're in the gall of bitterness and blah, blah, blah. So, now, somebody else read Acts 13:12. Notice the difference.
Then the proconsul believed when he saw what had occurred, for he was astonished at the teaching of the Lord.
So what astonished Sergius Paulus, the governor on the island of Patmos? Paphos. Okay, the teaching. He saw what happened when, remember, a mist came over, Paul laid his hands on the sky, and a mist came over him, he experienced temporary blindness. So he does acknowledge that Sergius Paulus, the governor, saw that, but what astonished him was the teaching of the word. See the difference between that and Simon. And here's what I'm going to tell you. One of the biggest dangers of the signs and wonders movement is that it places so much emphasis on the sign itself that it actually almost deviates from the truth to which the sign is supposed to be pointing. Does that make sense? That's a huge problem. If the vehicle of your ministry is so attractive to people that they never actually see the truth that you're trying to teach them, you got a problem. And this is one of the big problems with the signs and wonders movement today. Okay, it's based on experience. People say it happened. You can't deny that. No, don't try to deny it. Okay, the question is, what's behind it? All right, so that's important. Number two, in defense of spiritual warfare and power encounters. Those two words really do go together. Now, do you believe that spiritual warfare is a thing? Yeah, you better. If you don't, man, you gotta, I read your Bible again. You give me a passage of scripture that makes it absolutely clear that we're involved in spiritual warfare.
Daniel 10.
Daniel 10. Okay. What else? Daniel 10 is their demons are actually, at least in that case, there was a demon over Greece or Persia. How about for you personally? Give me a passage of scripture that makes it clear that you personally are involved in spiritual warfare.
Ephesians 6.
Ephesians 6. What's the purpose of the armor of God if there's no war going on? Right? What about 1 Peter 5? The devil's a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. We better be prepared. Okay? We are in a real battle. Okay? So spiritual warfare is a perfectly legitimate term. Now, do I believe that there are power encounters that go on today? Yeah, the concept of power encounter. Look, God's archenemy is Satan, right? We are involved. Because we're united with Christ. We're identified with Him, right? Mankind in general is involved because He's created the image of God. And so, when Satan goes after man, he goes after someone created in God's image. He's indirectly attacking God, right? So power encounter is a thing. It happens. But the power encounter movement has a different emphasis, okay? It emphasizes visible signs that draw attention to spiritual combat, okay? And it's all over the place, okay? So letter A, it squares with anthropology and an existential experience. Okay, what do we mean by that? In what way does spiritual warfare or power encounters square with anthropology? Do you remember from the reading what the author meant by that? He does comment. Oh, wait a minute. Is this one you haven't read yet? Okay, because I'm a little behind. Okay. In what sense does spiritual warfare and power encounters square with anthropology? Well, what is anthropology?
Man.
Okay, it's the study of man. Okay. Has the study of man been replete with spiritual encounters, spiritual opposition, yes, it has. Okay. So mankind from the very beginning has been, where is the very first encounter of man with spiritual forces? Garden of Eden. Doesn't take long, right? Did God really say? Here's a better idea. Okay, so it does square with the with man's experience. And what does the word existential, that second blank, mean? What does existential mean? Have you guys studied existentialism as a theological approach? That's a big deal. Existentialism.
I think I've heard of existentialism, at least in a secular sense, kind of going along the lines of like nothing matters, or was it all about the individual?
Okay. Yes. Existentialism is, and you can just define it in a lot of ways, but essentially it is connected with the word that follows it here, experience. It's the idea of something that's happening right now, independent of past experience or situations. Existential focuses on the here and now, what is happening right now. Okay. And one of the problems with power encounters and things like that, people emphasize so much what happened that they fail to make connections or to seek connections with the broader story of history. All right. So existentialism is very much about here and now. People who are existential in their approach to life don't really care much about history. It doesn't matter. It's right now what happens. It's my experience. It's my situation. Okay. And there does seem to be a tendency for people today, a lot of people really do lean in that direction. It's about right now. So anyway, time is up. We'll have to finish the next time around, but that gets the ball rolling for us. All right. So I encourage you, engage in spiritual warfare today, but don't attempt power encounters, supernatural manifestations, things like that.
Where are my plans?